Hello and welcome to CRN's webinar on predictions for cloud in 2018. I'm Trevor Trahan, Deputy Editor of CRN, and allow me to introduce you to today's panel. Starting with David Warburton, Senior Systems Engineer at F5 Networks. Thank you.
Good morning.
Greg Neese, Cloud Management Business Manager for Northern EMEA at VMware.
Good morning.
David M, Senior Security Researcher, Kaspersky Labs.
Good morning.
David Fern, Technical Director at Arrow. Matt Thomas, Channel Business Manager at Palo Alto Networks.
Morning.
And finally, Scott Register, Vice President of Product Manager at Ixia.
Morning, yes.
Thank you all for joining us today. There are 5 main topics that we're hoping to sort of get through. GDPR, security, hybrid cloud, Internet of Things, and cloud applications. I'm going to start with GDPR, and I'm going to start with David at F5 Networks. Last year was a big year of discussion and preparation for GDPR. You know, it's going to become a reality in May. Is the cloud-based environment that we're currently operating in, is it ready for GDPR?
I think it's a really interesting question because it's quite layered, to be honest with you. I think from my point of view, the technology, the different cloud deployments that there are largely ready. I mean, there's a big question mark in terms of, you know, which cloud service you're looking at using, whether it's infrastructure as a service, some kind of software as a service, whether it's platform, and the implications around the shared responsibility around those, and that differs depending on the platform. But I think actually the kind of main point for me isn't so much the technology and the platform provided by the cloud providers. It's more how people perceive the cloud being ready to use and how they perceive their responsibility in the cloud, you know, and whether they'd still take ownership about the risk and the information they put in the cloud. If you look at the likes of AWS and Azure, they've both put out things like so the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK have had their, I think, 14 different, you know, cloud principles they want to use that the customer should adhere to, and it's everything from good encryption to you know, allocating data, tags and things like that. And both AWS and Azure have responded to those, and they kind of, you can read a nice big document about how they kind of meet those requirements. There's lots of different accreditations like ISO 27001 for both of those. So actually, if you look at the technology and the processes in place by the cloud providers, they're very much in place and ready, I would say. It's more, the bigger question is how customers really maintain the risk and the ownership, as I would say, you know, as I said, when going to cloud, and make sure that they understand the gaps in some of the cloud providers' technologies and where they might need to augment them with other ones.
Greg, what's your view on how prepared we are now?
I think it's interesting from my perspective, the onus is still on the customer. So the enterprise who is still going to use the technologies that are out there. And I think for them, it's a case of doing their due diligence to ensure that it creates a part of their overall stance, but isn't actually, oh, I'm great, I'm going to the cloud and I've cured my GDPR challenges. So it's really a case of the people within the organization understanding what the piece of the puzzle this is going to fix with regards to GDPR, around where the data is, who has access to it. But I think ultimately it's their ability to build that as part of their overall stance that's the bigger challenge. And you know, to David's point, where are the gaps, and what do I need to do to ensure that I fill those gaps, to ensure that I've got my position straight, so that there's not a talk scenario, or you know, something where data goes missing and people start to get heavily fined for the loss.
Sure, David.
I agree with that completely. I think it's important, I think, for companies to realise that they can outsource the provision, but you can't necessarily outsource the responsibility. It's your data or your customer's data, and you know, absolutely, you need to do due diligence on that and make sure that you know where the data is, you know what conditions apply to it, because it could be your neck on the line if there is a breach.
So I'd agree to that partially. I'm going to be a little bit, take a devil's advocate position, because if you look at GDPR, very little of it is actually fixed through technology. A lot of it's fixed because at the end of the day it's about data privacy, and it's about the rights of the consumer to control and take better ownership of their own information. So actually I think that there's a huge hole in the fact that we're talking about technology, but actually what we need to be talking about is what cloud providers have put processes and operational sort of contingencies around how they are going to enhance or give enhanced services and capabilities around ensuring privacy, you know, allowing data to be, so for example, if someone comes and says, you know, I want my data. I want you to give me all my data. As we will see, lots and lots of organizations start to have to do when GDPR comes into effect. How is the cloud service provider helping the organization to actually establish those sort of, or deliver the data within the time set by the GDPR legislation as one of many sort of rules and regulations that the organizations are going to have to adhere to? And how does the cloud help to lower the overall sort of overhead on the data protection officer, the DPO, as we're now going to see in many organizations over certain sizes and scale? You know, how do these technologies fundamentally help the operational and the human issues of GDPR and what GDPR means to a wider organization?
Matt?
Yeah, no, as I said, David started off really nicely in terms of trying to understand where is the data residing. Is it in the infrastructure, is it in the platform, is it in the software as a service? I think what's really important for the resellers is to be able to ask and work with the customers on a number of key questions. So whenever I'm talking about GDPR to my customers or to my resellers, I'm saying to them, look, ask your customers where is that sensitive data stored in the cloud and what is the impact if that sensitive data was breached and got hold of. The next thing which we then need to understand is who has access to that data within your environment. Is it your employees, is it third parties, and what controls and parameters do we need to put in place to ensure that we are securing their access which they have to that data? And then finally, the final question which we ask is in reality, like, look, what do we need to do to protect that data and what is the impact that we have if that data is breached?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's where we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think following on that, it's not so much a technology question, or at least all the core technologies I think are there for data protection, for encryption, things like this. One of the key requirements of GDPR is pseudonymization of data. That means any private data has to be encrypted or masked or otherwise made sort of unreadable. So if it's compromised, you can't tell what user that was associated with. And actually the opportunity of moving all the data to the cloud gives a tremendous opportunity to sort of rethink how all your data is stored and the whole flow of taking it in, processing it, kind of scrubbing and hide it, and then eventually disposing of it. If you look at the average enterprise, there's data all over the place. It's in databases, it's in spreadsheets, it's very distributed, and that makes it very hard to manage in a secure fashion. Well, if you're now issuing a requirement that all that data has to be lifted out of the enterprise, out of spreadsheets on desktops and things like that, and put into one place, that's a tremendous opportunity for for resellers to go in and say, okay, no, you can't do that anymore. If you want to be compliant, you have to move all that data and put it in one place and then control it in a certain way. That's a tremendous, I think, service opportunity, and also an opportunity for enterprises to sort of get their data management under control, and largely it's not now. So that requirement presents, and the transition of moving all that data to cloud presents, I think, a huge opportunity.
Sure. And I might stay with you, Scott, on the second part of this. I mean, when the discussions around GDPR were taking place, it was talk about, is this just a requirement for resellers, or is this an opportunity for resellers in terms of what they can do with end users? Now, it can obviously be both, but where do you think the focus for the channel is going to be on this?
Well, I think it's a huge opportunity. I mean, there's the skill sets required to successfully deploy your environment and applications in the cloud and keep data secure and manage and controlling access to storage instances versus web tier versus database tier. That's not something that most companies are equipped for, right? There's not, just as there's not nearly enough qualified information security kind of personnel to go around. If information security in general is here, cloud security is down here. I mean, there just aren't that many experts. And so most enterprises need help. They need someone to guide them through this, because if you just say, all right, your CIO, CTO says, okay, we're going to go cloud. We want you to put all the stuff out there. The person who may be very adept but has kind of grown up managing Exchange servers and firewalls is not going to have the right set of techniques and skills to go manage that app deployment in the cloud successfully and securely and in a compliant fashion. So I think that's a huge opportunity to be the expert and come in and help with that transition.
Yeah, I don't think that GDPR should be treated any differently, whether it's in the cloud or wherever the data is residing. And there's no one single vendor which can actually offer a tool or technology which is going to make an end user compliant for GDPR. I think GDPR is more of a journey that we as the resellers have to take the customers along to be able to help them out. What they need to do is they need to ensure that they're offering consistent security to their customers. I think where they need to be looking at is like, look, and to offer consistent security, you have to look at data visibility. So you need to know where your data is residing, wherever it may be it that's on the endpoint, be it in the remote office or the branch office, be it at the HQ, in the private or the public cloud, in SaaS environments. What's crucial though is that I don't think we should say to the resellers that they need to look at GDPR compliance. They need to look at it as part of a journey which they're taking the customers on, and use it as more of a compliance, as more of a holistic view of security and their over security architecture.
I think it's interesting that you say that, because we all know that things change as well. So GDPR and the rules and regulations that sit around that will evolve over time. And so what we do today, we have to make sure that we're not putting up potential roadblocks in the future. So what's my contingency? What do I do if I need to get hold of my data? What if the rules and regulations and legislation changes and I have all this stuff in the public cloud, but the change in regulation says I need to now bring that back into a private cloud environment? How do I manage those types of environments? And again, I think that that's a huge opportunity for the reseller community to be at the forefront and guiding and helping customers identify what that strategy looks like. What are my contingency plans in the event of X, Y, and Z, whatever that may be in the future, and then ensuring that if and when that does arise, then helping them with that process to make that transition back.
So I was working with an big end user very recently with one of our partners, and sort of helping them do a bit of a discovery, not necessarily on the data that they need to protect, but the various different instances where that data could be exposed. And we started looking at, okay, you have a very distributed workforce of laptops all over the UK. Each of them have managing their own spreadsheets, managing their own sort of sales records. That's all data that needs to now be brought under control in the GDPR world. How do you turn around to a human being and say, yeah, you know that spreadsheet you've got that you track your sales, and you can't have that anymore? So actually, one of the places where we immediately identified a really big opportunity for cloud is you take the spreadsheet off, or the spreadsheet software, as a simple example, off that person's laptop and put it into the cloud. So they're leveraging either Google Docs type platform or Office in the cloud. And essentially they're now leveraging one single place. Their laptop essentially becomes stateless. We were talking about, okay, shut down the ability for the USB memory drives to be plugged in, because there's so many holes where GDPR can be essentially, an organisation can fail GDPR very quickly and easily. And I mean, being a little bit, what's the right word, sort of looking into the future of where the more nefarious areas of our world will go, PPI is coming to an end, right? You've got loads of organisations who have made a big living on phoning out people going, you're entitled to payment protection insurance, we're going to go and claim it for you. What's the next big scam that's going to occur? How about we phone up and we will go and get your data, and if their company can't give you your data back within 72 hours, whatever the GDPR regulation settles on, we can then sue or settle, or this is going to become a huge issue, because there's money to be made out of, in every direction, of compromising people in GDPR and saying, do you want your 4% fine, or do you want to settle this, and pay my client? I think we're massively underestimating the impact that GDPR will have on everything, because people that can make money out of it will go and try and make money out of essentially taking advantage of the GDPR and people's goodwill and nature and data. And I think we're going to see, if there's one thing I will sadly state, it's not necessarily the resellers that are in this position, but end users, from my personal perspective, are vastly underprepared and have not taken GDPR anywhere near seriously enough. There's a handful of customers who really have, but considering this is coming into effect in May, in 4 months' time, 4 months and change essentially, I've not seen anyone with their hair on fire trying to implement the vast process and sort of strategy changes that GDPR is going to require to give them any level of security or proof that they're actually trying to do something to make this right?
I think that's good. So quite a lot of customers are complacent, thinking they're already compliant,
So
that they've already got everything in place, and that they don't need to do anything because their data is already secure. And I think it's really important that the reseller community is educating the customers in terms of, oh, let's understand what we need to do. Let's understand where your data is. Let's understand the security which you have around that data to make sure that you're not going to get breached, or if you are, what do you need to do, and what are the processes you've got in place to ensure that you're notifying the right people in the right due time about that particular breach.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to echo that and kind of agree with it. I mean, I still hear from some customers that ask how they can avoid becoming GDPR compliant in the first place, almost entirely missing the whole point of the whole of the whole regulation. So I think from my point of view, a big part of the reseller community and their, what they can get out of GDPR is really, certainly some technology kind of solutions that are going to help here, but a big part of it is the education and helping with the journey and the process, defining the processes, getting the right roles and responsibilities in place, and possibly even taking over some of those roles for the actual end user.
Sure. Just want to move on to security next, the second theme of today, and start with you, David, on this. As is always the case in technology, it may expand quickly, and security needs to keep up with that. Do you think that's happened in cloud? Do you think that the development in cloud have been matched by the security needed?
Well, I think cyber criminals go where the crowds go, and or where the clouds go in this case. So as people rush to put data in there, that becomes a sort of lucrative pot that they want to get their hands on. And the added benefit, I guess, from a cyber criminal point of view, is that if you can kind of get multiple goodies in one hit, then so much the better. So actually you get economies of scale from a cybercrime point of view by targeting a cloud provider. So that's one area of it. One that kind of gets overlooked, though, I think, is the fact that companies are going to be accessing data in some way from devices, whether that's on the road or in the traditional office or at home, and they're going to make sure that they are nailed down and secured as well, because at the end of the day, my data may be in the cloud, but I have access to that data, and one of the benefits of this is that I've got access from anywhere at any time, and if I'm not secure, then somebody can get access to that data without hacking the cloud provider. And I guess in between those two things, you've got the whole issue of, well, not necessarily somebody hacking it, but what if it's misconfigured? We've seen several instances this year alone, this last 12 months alone, of AWS buckets being misconfigured so that anybody can get access to them. And so actually doing the kind of the normal process on this in terms of, well, what have we got, where is it, how do we access it, and what do we need to do to make sure that only the right people get to see it? In a sense, that doesn't change as a process. It's just where that data is that is changing. From a reseller community point of view, well, I mean, we do an IT risk survey every year, and in the last one we did, about 50% of companies recognize that actually with the shortage of cybersecurity skills, they're going to need to, they're going to have difficulties ramping up to take care of security. And that provides a huge opportunity for the reseller community, because certainly in the same survey, 60% of companies said, yeah, they thought being able to get somebody else to manage this for them was actually a viable solution, one that would be useful. So that's a huge opportunity there, I think, in terms of, and the same sort of thing that we said with GDPR about helping companies on that journey, which incorporates not just data protection from a GDPR point of view, but the whole issue of security in the whole.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things we predicted last year was we thought that there would be a major breach within public cloud. And I think we've seen it. If you look at the dark web, you can now buy hundreds of Windows servers, which are, say, up to $15,000 for a Windows server, because it's got the users and the application and the data within there, and people are able to purchase that through the dark web. As David said, the misconfiguration of applications and servers is also is a huge issue, and this is how we're seeing the breaches happening within public cloud. And it's about educating the users as well, because I think a lot of the times the users are the ones who actually open up the risk by being caught by a phishing attack or whichever it may be. And as soon as the cyber criminal has access to that particular user and has access to their credentials, they can then go into the servers, and it's just lateral movement then to wherever the data may reside, because the public cloud is connected to the private cloud or to the data center or to the network, or the endpoint, wherever it may be. It's about making sure that we put those controls in place. So educating the users and getting the resellers to work with end user education, working with around looking at encryption or two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication to make sure that these processes are put in place to make it as difficult as possible for the cyber criminal not only to get access but then to also traverse across.
Yeah, I would say that the security tools and even sort of management paradigms have definitely not kept pace. I mean, if you look at, I went to Amazon reInvent, 2 months ago, and just look at the sheer amount of kind of stuff that all the cloud providers roll out like every month. I mean, they can barely keep up with themselves. Certainly, the security things haven't kept up, and part of that is I think the legacy kind of security tool providers and those in the security space think about security in a certain way. You're used to thinking about like, well, I've got this server and it has an IP address, and the IP address is always there. So I set up rules to say, who can get access to this. That whole paradigm just goes away in the cloud because the server addresses are transient, they're fluid, they may overlap. So the way that you think about just writing security policy becomes very, very different, and it's not necessarily straightforward to sort of translate that into cloud. And you're exactly right about misconfiguration. In the sort of on-premises world that we all grew up in, you put a firewall there at your perimeter, and everything in your network was behind that. So just by definition, no one could get to your database server, your mail, whatever it is, without getting through that firewall. And now every developer can take an instance basically that's running in the cloud. Pick your provider and open it up to the world, right? The architecture is controlled by the cloud provider, and they build it in a way that every instance can just get to the internet and can be reached from the internet. And so the policy management becomes very, very important. A lot of the security tools just sort of don't apply anymore, and we're definitely way behind the curve in keeping up with that. And I mean, there are a lot of legacy companies, all of us who have been doing security for a long time are making moves there. There's huge numbers of startups that are kind of focusing on that. Some will make it, some not. But both the approach and the products that kind of deal with securing the cloud are very, very different. There's still a role for things like intrusion detection, for knowing you're under attack. But the way that you respond is very different now, because now by the time you figure out there was an attack, that whole instance may be gone, right? And so it sort of changes the focus to rapid detection. How do I stop it from happening again, rather than forensics and sort of cleaning up that a server after a breach. So we're definitely behind the curve.
The interesting thing for me is that part of the challenge that enterprises face is that security has caused their people who want an agile environment to go and develop in to go to these public clouds, because the internal security policies and networking and various other things hasn't enabled infrastructure to be delivered to the hands of the developers so that they can create the new solutions that the consumer of today needs in their hands. So it's almost you've got to fix what you have inside your own private cloud first, before then thinking about, right now, how am I going to, and also whilst I'm fixing that, what am I doing now which is going to prepare me to enable me to stretch out into the public cloud and take some of my policy and procedure and security stance with me into the public cloud, and working with, because all the vendors here are all working with the public cloud providers, and will have the ability to deliver software into those environments which provide that capability. So what then is the case of how do I link my private cloud to my public cloud and ensure that there is that security and networking layer which provides me with a starting point, and then obviously there's this Pandora's box of all of this other stuff, but you've got to have a starting point and a consistency. And if you don't have that, then you know, you're almost putting sticking plasters on a water leak, and you've just it's too big a problem.
I think it goes back to, it kind of echoes back to GDPR, right? Which is largely, yes, it's some technology, but it's largely people and process and the policies around that. And where I'm going with that is that actually, if you've got the policies in place that define what, you know, the right kind of data tags to show the kind of criticality and the amount of personal information, some data that defines who has access and who can use it and where that data can go, the technology's in place, then actually some of these solutions, technology should already be there. If we look to more kind of the serverless architectures in the likes of AWS and Azure now, that further removes the kind of traditional operations guys and security guys and people, it gets even increasingly hard. And yet, if you've got those policies in place, actually, that should be less of a challenge to kind of stop that from happening. So I think from a technical point of view, yes, it's policies, but I think also it's a visibility, which is probably the biggest security kind of gap I would see in cloud, getting that visibility of not only the protocols and what's actually going on within one particular cloud instance, but actually if you're hybrid cloud across multiple cloud instances, you know, whether that's multiple infrastructure as a service platforms, whether it's kind of Office email here and some kind of Google Docs over there, what you really need to be able to see is what's happening across all of your platforms, you know, and get some consistent kind of reporting and analytics.
And I think consistency is crucial, and then the visibility is there. And I think what's important then is it's about, well, look, organisations nowadays need to have a prevention-based strategy. It's no longer viable to have detect and then remediate. And I think once you've got that prevention-based strategy in place, it's then about like, how do we then automate and orchestrate the information which we've seen, be it that it's from the one customer or any of our customers who have found this threat, and push it out to all areas where we have that same security. And so I think that's what's crucial for ourselves, is that we are able to look at moving away from any form of manual intervention in any way, shape, or form. It's like, look, when we see something, how can we automate it as quickly as possible to make sure that all elements where we know that data is housed or where those users are, we can actually apply the appropriate prevention-based technologies which we need through from there. But when you bring it back to public cloud, I think it's also about looking at the shared security model. Because I think when you look at AWS, or you look at Azure, or you look at Google Cloud, they're responsible for the infrastructure. They're not the end user is responsible for the data and the applications which they're placing into those environments. And I think it's really important for the reseller community to understand that shared security model and understand how they can help to drive a security strategy for those customers within the public cloud environments, because I think too many people just think, well, we can just use the as good as it gets security which we have within AWS or Azure. They need to treat those public cloud environments exactly as they would treat their virtualized data center or their enterprise network. It's got to be the same level of security, enterprise-based security, wherever they have that access point.
And I think one of the dangers, of course, particularly, I suppose, for small and medium-sized businesses that don't have the in-house expertise in security, one of the dangers, I think, is that they think, well, okay, there's lots of obvious benefits from the cloud, and one of them actually is that we can kind of outsource our headache on this. And I was at a conference, admittedly 18 months ago, where somebody seriously at a C-level was suggesting, oh, we outsource our mail provision so we don't need to worry about the security. And they were serious, and everybody around the panel from different security vendors kind of gulped a little bit as they realized that this was a serious proposition. But I don't think they're unique. No. You know, and one of the key things, and again it comes back to what the reseller community can do to inform this discussion, is about being aware of what the issues are. And the fact that, you know, again, going back to something I said before, you can outsource provision, but you can't necessarily outsource responsibility. It's your data. And so that's really important. So it's not just, I mean, you mentioned the education issue with people at the kind of, at the face of the computer, but actually there's an education issue at the director or board level too.
Yeah. I think that's almost the bigger challenge, to be honest with you. It's almost kind of our responsibility. It's the security architects within organisations. It's their responsibility to really kind of educate the board and get them to understand risk. And I hope, if anything really, really positive comes of the likes of GDPR, it's that people take more of a risk-based approach, because I think a lot of organisations really do. But I think it highlights, and yes, you get some organisations that are maybe not so much risk averse, but actually want to take the risk, because it gives them some business advantage. Actually, they're happy to sign off the risk, but they need to understand what they're signing off. They need to understand the gaps, again, in technical and the process in various cloud providers.
Yeah, I think one of the sort of trade-offs as people move to the cloud and think about security, that yes, it is true that cloud providers probably do a better job of securing kind of the core infrastructure than you can, right? I mean, they can spend more money on that core security. But true, you own the application, and also when you're looking at risk and sort of risk mitigation, if you as an enterprise are dealing with, say, a traditional hosting provider, you typically have more leverage in sort of contractually mitigating risk. You can sign something into your contract with the provider that they assume certain responsibility, legal or otherwise. Amazon, Microsoft, they're not going to change their contract for you. It's going to be very much take it or leave it, and so that contractual mitigation is probably no longer available to you. And it is ultimately your responsibility, just as you pointed out, to secure the data. So you certainly can't think, oh, I'm secure because I go there. You can think, well, the core, kind of the underlying operating system, like routers, switches, whatever, yeah, that's probably secure better than I can, but the data is, we've talked about all the configuration problems, things like that. Your data is certainly exposed, so you cannot make that leap that it's in the cloud, therefore it's secure. And even things like Spectre and Meltdown, right? I mean, look at the impact of those on the cloud providers. I mean, that's going to be a very difficult thing for them to deal with. So you can't just assume, oh, it's in the cloud, it's safe.
Sure. I might go to a question from Cindy here. Cindy's asking about a cross-cloud strategy. Which tools would you recommend for making that work?
I personally, for me, I mean, we kind of touched on it before about the perimeter moving for applications and data, because really the perimeter used to be this big hard shell we used to put around the kind of data center, make sure the bad guys couldn't get in. But now we've talked about kind of spreadsheets on laptops, we've got data on mobile phones, we've got SaaS applications, various kind of cloud providers. So really the perimeter need to move. They need to go much, much kind of closer to the application. So technologies that provide, I think, an easy kind of quick win almost is better identity and access management, identifying the actual users that come and not just maybe allowing access based on IP address, but who is the user, what groups are they in, what's the device they're using, where are they located, what were they doing 5 minutes ago, and have they suddenly moved from the UK now to a China IP address? So getting much better visibility and context in terms of who's accessing that application would be a key one, I think.
Yeah. And that is a great question, actually. I mean, a lot of the enterprise customers we have are trying very hard to avoid locking into a specific cloud provider, because they look at where they were in the sort of on-premises data center world, not to mention names, but they typically go with a big networking vendor. And even if some other company came in and had a better switch, router, something else, it was very hard to integrate that into that single vendor environment. And so they're locked into pricing, support, whatever, from their chosen networking vendor. And they're trying very hard to avoid that as they move to public cloud. They want Google, they want Azure, they want, pick Alibaba. If you may want a choice of those. And so, for us, that's been very important as we develop products to make sure that they're very cross-cloud. And so, without recommending specific things, I would say that's, as you're considering products for your, to secure a cloud deployment or monitor or whatever, that making sure that it works with whatever cloud providers you're interested in, Google and Amazon and Microsoft and whoever else, is very important, right? Because that otherwise you end up going down that same sort of rabbit hole that you were in before.
But I think the reality is, though, that this is fundamentally a difficult thing to achieve because if you look at the benefits of a multi-cloud strategy, the availability goes through the roof for peanuts money. You end up in a situation where you can truly, have a 6, 7, 8 nines availability platform. You can take advantage of the nuances of different systems. You can do all very clever things. But the reason that organizations aren't all jumping up and down going, yes, we've reached multi-cloud, this is great, is because it's fundamentally incredibly difficult. And actually, I don't think that there's a tool out there today that is the gold bullet, silver bullet, whatever you want to call it, solution to a multi-cloud approach. I think it's actually, from my personal experience in deploying and working in multi-cloud worlds, it's about architecting for multi-cloud. It's about application portability. It's about moving to a serverless environment, and it's about really and truly hybrid cloud. It's about actually saying, okay, what's very difficult to move from cloud to cloud? My data. It's high risk, it's high cost, and it takes a long time. So actually, how can I implement a hybrid cloud strategy that means that my data is in one place and I leverage the best, whether it's commercially the most attractive, whether it's feature functionality the most attractive, because these cloud providers, they're releasing new functionality all the time. You know, Google comes out with one piece of functionality, then AWS comes out with something slightly better. And to gain that competitive advantage, you want to be able to take advantage of those new features and functionality quickly in an agile way. The only way to do that is to retain your data centrally and leverage those services as and when you require. And that's hybrid cloud. But that's still not, you know, straightforward. But I tell you, it's 1,000 times easier than trying to use a cloud broker or balance across multiple clouds in a pure public way.
And I think it's really important as well to understand the differences between the cloud providers as well. Because if you look at, say, for instance, on a basic level, say throughput, AWS has a completely different throughput capability than what Azure does. And if you're trying to transmit your data between the different ways, you've got to be aware of it. So AWS is 4 gig, Azure is 1 gig. So when you're building those hybrid environments, you've got to ensure that you have that understanding about how the different nuances are going to work together in terms of the different offerings which they have. And then make sure that you've got that. It's still, I think, harking back to consistent security being deployed, so that you've got that, you understand what is your security which you're trying to do within those environments, and how do we deploy it to make sure that the data is looked after in the right way.
Okay, great. I might move on to the Internet of Things for our fourth theme today. You know, how does the panel think that the Internet of Things and cloud will interact this year, and what sort of Internet of Things cloud developments can we expect?
So I'll jump in first, if you don't mind. So I think from my point of view, IoT, with regards to cloud, you can't separate the two. Just from the sheer scale of IoT means you need huge platforms that can scale and can be orchestrated very kind of easily. But the biggest challenge, I think, from a security point of view is ignoring the devices themselves, because they have all sorts of problems typically. We kind of hear horror stories from cheap devices, you know, being kind of rushed out to market and so on. It's more authenticating those devices and also understanding what they do, the languages they talk, the protocols they talk. You know, it's quite easy, well, it's relative these days to understand a kind of web-based protocols and some APIs. You know, it's HTTP, HTML, XML, the kind of language of the web. But a lot of these devices are using different protocols, whether it's COAP, whether it's MQTT. Now, when you look at kind of cloud, yes, it can provide the scale that you need for IoT devices. And again, if you look at AWS and Azure, they've got dedicated IoT services they can offer. You know, you don't have to go and build your own on some kind of IaaS platform. But again, if you don't have security services there that understand those protocols, you're just opening up a front door and just letting that protocol, that traffic in and out with no idea of what's actually happening. So from my point of view, I think the biggest challenge is really understanding what those devices are doing. If they got compromised, for example, can you understand the traffic in the first place to even begin to report and put some controls on it?
I also think you've got to, you know, as an organisation, if we start from the very basics, as soon as you start to deploy an IoT strategy, you start to run into this IT versus OT world. So this information technology paradigm versus the operational technology paradigm. You know, up until probably last year, maybe the year before that, you know, the two shall never meet, because at the end of the day, the air conditioning or the, you know, building control system in a building or in a city or whatever it might be had a very, very different need and a very different security profile to the server switch core data center infrastructure or cloud infrastructure you had. But now we're seeing, you know, air conditioning units and building management systems and lighting and all these things being put on the same network as, you know, so it massively increases the attack surface of an organization. And whether you are taking that data and dumping it to the cloud, whether you're taking that data and using a hybrid approach to sort of store and forward almost to the cloud providers depending on feature functionality, I don't think that IT versus OT paradigm has been thought about enough by organisations. And I think we're seeing the breaches occurring where, you know, someone's come in with a high-vis jacket on, plugged into an air conditioning unit and managed to actually navigate themselves straight through into the core infrastructure, because no one's thinking of that as a possible attack vector.
Yeah, that's funny. One of our partners actually in Japan demonstrated that just last year, that they showed they could walk in, unplug a light panel from the wall, it's just Ethernet, right?
Yeah.
And so they plug it in, do some sniffing, reverse the protocols, and they could take over the building. They could, unlock doors. They could trigger fire alarms. And you're right. If it's on if the data center network is plugged into that too, they can get to that. But just as a proof of concept, they showed walking in blind, and in just a few hours, they could basically take over the entire building just by plugging into a light switch.
Exactly, but many security managers are sort of with all due respect, burying their head in the sand at the level and the scope of this risk. They want to adopt IoT, but are they involved in the conversations with the air conditioning manufacturer, as an example? I apologise if you're an air conditioning manufacturer, I'm sort of slating you here, but you get the idea. Are they involved in those conversations? Are they talking about, okay, but what level of security are you putting in place? How am I going to secure the data coming from that air conditioning system, which is streaming sensor data back on temperature and humidity and various predictive maintenance pieces? How am I controlling and making sure that that data isn't nefarious?
And getting back, I think you made the point earlier about not just product, but also people and process, and you were talking about the IT versus OT. So that does break down some of the traditional lines in the organization of separation of, you're the security guy, but you don't have access to this. And you may be the application guy, and you don't have access to security. Well, DevOps definitely changes that. And so now you have a person who can both control, let's say, security policy and what the application does, for instance. And so that's a change to the organizational structure. And I mean, that impacts compliance, that impacts, roles, responsibility, a lot of things that I think we're just starting to think through, because in your traditional structure, you could separate. Oh, this guy doesn't have access to data. Yeah, he writes the security policy, but he can't touch like the data or the apps. And now that's gone away. And so I think we're really just starting to understand. Okay, so what does that mean? How do I make sure a bad person can't take the entire organization down by impacting both?
I like crediting Bruce Schneier, the kind of US cryptographer, who basically says, and has been saying a lot recently, that everything's a computer. And I think that's kind of true, and the reason I kind of say that is because I think up until recently, and probably still now, when a lot of organizations, the security architects are still very much looking at networks and feeds and maybe some kind of web apps or protocols. And actually they need to start working with supply chain management and the board, and it needs to be a much more kind of holistic view to security than just a network/security problem. There's a kind of, because security is so hard, I think there's been a kind of slow kind of walk towards flattening networks, like you said, kind of opening things up because it's just a bit easier. And actually, we need to go back the other way slowly. And that's going to be, again, partly people and process and some technology to help us do that, because it is hard. There's a lot of stuff to look at. But we need to start having a kind of trust no one or zero trust kind of model in more places, and stop implicitly trusting these devices because they look shiny and they've got no box.
Sorry.
I was going to say, I think also people sort of there's a danger, again, especially where there's not kind of entrenched expertise in the company, of just adopting something. So plug it in and go, which, unlike 20 years ago, is possible. And what I'm driving at is that in many cases, let's say CCTV cameras, for example, or aircon, they're performing functions that have existed for generations. And so what people are looking at is saying, well, okay, this is the latest and greatest, plug it in, let's go, because it's digital, it's more effective, more efficient, whatever, we get control over it, but without looking at what the knock-on effects are. And they're not even knowing what questions to ask. And it can be, what functionality is there, or it can be, what functionality do I not need? I mean, we did some research on CCTV cameras in a city and discovered that actually the city hadn't switched on encryption, which meant that it was possible to actually use this as a peer-to-peer network and fake information going on in one place, so that misinformation was being sent across the network back to the control center. And it wasn't because the manufacturer of the CCTV camera hadn't enabled encryption, it was because the user of that device, the city, hadn't decided to switch it on. We see the same thing, let's face it, with consumers. You buy a baby monitor, and maybe you don't need it to stream all that information over the internet, but you've got it and you don't ask the question, and you don't look at, can I switch it off? Do I need it?
I think I just want to explore a bit further something that David mentioned earlier. We talk about GDPR, security, hybrid cloud, IoT. the theme that's coming through in my mind is, and also to your point, David, is that if we don't break down the barriers that exist between teams today, we are going to have some major challenges in the future. And I think that organisational change and our ability, to David's point also, is to how do we supplement teams that are already in place with a skill set which they may not have, which might form part of something which develops an overall IoT strategy, which then has an impact on hybrid cloud, which then has an impact on security and GDPR, which then has a seat on the board. So how do we help organisations break down those barriers? And I think this is the real opportunity for our resellers, is to go in and have a chat with those guys and say, multiple stakeholders need to come to the table, and we need to come up with a plan that considers all of the different things. And it's like you say, this all has the impact on our customers with regards to strategy and what they're looking to try and do to appeal to their consumer. My stock story is, I've got, through hook or by crook, I've managed to have 6 children, aged between 15 and 23. So if anybody's looking for a consumer group, they're rented out by the hour. But basically, I see my kids interacting with companies through mobile technology, and it terrifies me. My eldest daughter's had 3 bank accounts with different vendors already, and I've still got the one that I had, which my dad opened for me when I was 16 years old, right? 10 years ago. So the thing that is, we have to help our customers and our resellers look at is, how do we connect what we're doing with the overall outcome, and what are the barriers we need to break down to ensure that that outcome is achieved securely, it's achieved with the maximum compliance, but it's performant, but it's all of the and it's cost effective, and that's where we need to get to. And I think that that's the huge opportunity that sits out there for the resellers today.
Yeah, 100%.
Sure. Okay, then I might move on to the final section today, which is cloud applications. Matt, I might start with you on this. I mean, what can we expect from cloud applications this year? What's going to be the main focus area for cloud apps?
I think if we take it into like public cloud and the application which they've used, I think you saw a lot of organisations initially start to take a lot of basic workloads over to the public cloud. They were taking backup and DR. They were taking things like dev test environments over there. I think what you're going to see nowadays is it was almost like a lift and ship approach which they had. I think now what you're going to find in terms of the applications they're going to start using AI, they're going to start using machine learning to actually look at ways in which we can say all of this data which we have within our cloud environments, how can a retailer make the most use of that to basically say, well, look, where do I place my product on the shelf because of this is where the buying criteria goes. I think this is where the channel needs to start to understand is like, look, what are the end users utilising the data for which they're housing within the public cloud environments, and how can they help to make the most use of that data? And be that's either by recommending technologies which go down the lungs of, say, analytics and that side of things, which is going to make the most use of the information which they're housing today.
I think, I just, so cloud applications market, hybrid cloud market share, I think, to your point, David, 90% of all workloads are still going to run in the private cloud for the foreseeable future. Okay, so market share says one thing, mind share says something else. The mind share of cloud native apps and the public cloud is huge compared to actually where people are spending their money. So I think, again, one of the things that we're going to have to help with, and the resellers are going to have to help with, is helping line of business managers and the key decision makers and the budget holders within our customers to say, hang on a second, you've got a huge maintain budget, or you've got a huge maintain estate, which is the stuff that that 15 years ago people said would never virtualize. And guess what? It's happened. And we're on this 15-year journey with cloud, I think, and we're only just beginning it. We're right at the very beginning, and I think that what the IT departments and the customers that we deal with today, what we have to focus on is what are we going to deliver for the IT department, which is going to allow the developer to achieve their goal of supporting the business.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say, we always talk about server or service. So a reseller has to help their end customer to decide whether or not they run it on a server or consume it as a service. And that is one of the biggest sort of questions and one of the biggest values, I think, specifically in this world, in the cloud applications world, that our resellers have to go and help. And that is a conversation that is not just commercial, it's security, it's GDPR, it's what's effectively going to give us the best possible competitive advantage over other things. If we're looking at spinning up new services, actually it might be best to start it as a service, and then as and when it becomes big enough or the scale demands it, that it makes more commercial sense to be on-prem, then we can move it from server to service. And what's the transition plan? And that's one of the things that we're not seeing enough, I don't personally think, is organisations having that discussion and resellers going in and almost being the starters of those discussions. Yeah.
For me, I think I think the challenge, and you can see it as an opportunity as well for both, I think, vendors like ourselves and the reseller community, is talking to the right teams, because it's increasingly more the developer guys and girls, obviously. It's the DevOps teams, it's the people that just almost, I don't want to use the term shadow IT, but it is those teams that just bypass traditional IT who we're all talking to and we're securing budgets for to make sure they've got good enterprise security. Meanwhile, the developers are just spinning up containers in Azure and so on. And yes, there are kind of, we can still put traditional technologies and solutions on, in a virtualized environment in Azure and AWS. But actually, the other problem we've got is the DevOps kind of world and application architecture is going more microservices. Not that it's a new technology, but it's with the kind of realization of containers and serverless technologies, it's becoming increasingly easy. Now it's fine, again, we can do a great job at securing the perimeter, we can put VMs into Azure, we can provide our own hosted services maybe, but actually what are those microservices containers doing while they talk to each other? If there's some compromise in that container, or there's something that isn't obvious as it comes in through the front door, so to speak, suddenly now this kind of malicious activity can all go on, talk between these different containers and these different microservices, almost completely undetected. And meanwhile, it's those guys that we're not educating, we're not being in front of, the DevOps teams, that I think really needs to kind of change.
I think one thing, sort of following on that one, if you're asking about what are the sort of trends in 2018, certainly the availability of microservices and services that do really advanced things means that if you're even a mid-sized company, you can now have an application that does really smart things. If you think about, if you want, 5 years ago, if you wanted an app that had natural language recognition or image processing or something like that, you sort of had to have scientists, people in-house who could build all that. And now that's all done for you, right? Like all these advanced services. And again, if you look at what the cloud providers are kind of providing just as built-in services or specialist, providers who sit on top of that, what they're providing is huge. Now, most enterprises, can't keep track with what that is. So I think one of the roles of the resellers is just going to the company and say, hey, if you want your, whatever it is, your travel app, your whatever, to go beyond the sort of old school tech stuff and start understanding speech and doing, all these advanced things, you don't have to understand that. You make this little Lambda call or whatever, and you get back what you need. That certainly does open the door, though, for all kinds of security problems on the back end. So one of the things I think we'll see is rapid adoption of technologies and kind of mainstream applications from any size, company that does really like amazing sophisticated stuff because it's so easy to take advantage of those back end, services. But how like that will also create security exposures, right? And so that dealing with containerless or serverless architectures, dealing with containers, dealing for security there. Someone on the back end, whether it's the enterprise or the reseller, has to provide that so that that app isn't suddenly compromised.
I think we've seen a creation of a new channel over the last year or so as well with the Born in the Cloud partners. In terms of these guys they're development focused, they're consultative focused. The security is probably not part of what they're even talking to the end users about. So to me, the channel's also got an idea as to why don't we try and form alliances with these Born in the Cloud partners so that we can say to themselves, look, you're there doing the development, you're there doing the consult, you're taking the potentially the end user through that, the creation of their cloud environment. But then let's us partner with you guys to then start talking about security and how we can then manage your security and how we can manage your data within your environments.
Because the concern for an end user is that the bias that comes from a cloud-first partner could sway or in some way change the outcome of the solution into something that best fits that definition of a partner. I think you're absolutely right. Resellers need to go and find well-balanced partnerships. And actually, I think if we saw one really, really standout thing in 2017, it was corporatism. It was organizations saying, do you know what? Let's go and work with other organizations that complement us. Let's go and not be afraid of sharing our customer database and sharing our opportunities with people who previously we would have probably, seen as direct competition, but actually now, being niche is not a bad thing. So lowering the number of things you do, but being really good at them, and partnering with other organisations who have done the same, and essentially can complement you and give you a really balanced view and provide, at the end of the day, the best possible solution to the end user, which is surely what we're all trying to do.
I think with regards to the apps piece as well, I think there's a huge opportunity around pipeline management. So there's a lot of people developing in various different ways, whether it's containers and whether it's traditional apps or that sort of thing. An enterprise needs it to go, whatever that application is, needs it to go through a standard process to release, to go into production. And I think that what happens is going to, to your point, Matt, is about the, born in the cloud, it's great, we're going to do things in a different way. And sometimes when it comes to go live and release, people are like, well, hang on a second, who's checked the compliance? Yeah. And what is our stance regards performance versus cost? And who's monitoring how much this is going to cost and what's my cloud consumption model? And what data am I transferring and how much is that costing me? And so I think that there needs to be some, I think there's a huge opportunity for our partners there to go, okay, we can help you manage that pipeline out to release. And through that process, I can then give you an idea about how it's going to perform, what it's going to cost, and what the risks and who's going to sign off on this and go, right, okay, I'm happy with that risk versus the opportunity that it creates.
What's the quality assurance process for an application that is distributed over multiple services, with multiple microservices, with multiple integrations? Yeah. I mean, that just sounds like a
cloud compliant test automation becomes very, very important, and no person can be responsible for testing each build. It's got to be, I've got a new thing, I've got an automated test suite that validates security, all of that stuff, and that's just part of it, and it just happens, and it can't require someone to go look at it.
It's got to be the sausage machine process. And I think it's interesting, going back to something we discussed earlier, is just, I think there's a real opportunity for centres of excellence within organisations, and creating this multi-skilled pod of people who will have oversight of either a process, either the policy, going to developers who want to get access to infrastructure quickly. What's the best way to go and do this? What sort of workload are you wanting to get a hold of? Where do you want it to reside when it goes live? And then who's going to make the decision? Well, let's put it back to machine learning, put it back to the automation piece. That way, if you go through automation and policy, you're protecting yourself when it comes to your stance, when it comes to security. So any time that you go outside of the boundaries, you're going to create challenges for yourself. So find some consistency, find a policy that you can live with, find some automation which delivers the workloads to the people that they want, control it, whether it's public cloud or private cloud. Get the control in place. And I think that's a real key thing for our resellers to be able to go and do. And I think that it's just a natural place for them to reside and go and talk to our stakeholders and go, we can provide you with that control. And also that, and as an outcome of that, you will still be able to make your budgets, make your performance targets, and deliver the revenue and services that your business is looking to deliver. Okay,
brilliant. So I might close out today by sort of putting you all on the spot. Perhaps starting.
You've been doing that for the last
Perhaps starting with you, David. I mean, just a sort of 30-second main takeaway of today, or perhaps what's the one thing that the channel needs to know about cloud this year?
I'd say everything, to be honest. And I say it slightly flippantly. Security is hard. Security has always been pretty hard, and it's just getting harder. I think the idea about circle of excellences within each reseller community or each reseller or partner is a really good idea, but it is difficult. Okay, you're going to need to grow the team because there's only so much one person can learn within one particular cloud provider's environments or security sort of services, let alone all the other providers out there. And as to today's point before, we do need multi-cloud skills. We can't really just specialize in one cloud provider, otherwise we do become very biased and we might miss security gaps, we might miss other opportunities elsewhere.
Great.
Two things. First of all, collaborate. I think it's super important that everybody collaborates in this environment, and that goes for the cloud providers, it goes for the vendors, it goes for the resellers. You've got to find the right solution depending on what the client is asking for, not the first solution that comes to mind. And then the second piece is around, we wonder why cloud hasn't been universally adopted, and everybody says we're all in the cloud. Help people plan and get our customers, I think it's 30% of enterprise customers have a formal plan for cloud. Get a plan in place. Once you have the plan in place, then you can corral resources around it. Corral resources, corral budgets, find the opportunity for our customers to spend money.
I'm going to pick up on something Greg said actually and say that a process is really important because like it or not, we're going to be in a mixed economy for quite some time. And the key is to look at this as a process rather than looking at this or that technology or service that's available and to be, I guess, the enabler for a company that, we can do that. We can help you with this overall process of which cloud is a part.
So we've maybe been a little bit doom and gloom for the last hour, talking about the various challenges that are facing the channel and the IT industry as a whole this year, but don't let any of that stifle innovation. I think it's still so important that organisations look forward and look at everything we've spoken about today as, yes, something to be mindful of, but actually the reason we're talking about this is because of all the opportunity that all of these technologies sort of place upon an organisation to innovate and to redefine what they do, how they do it, to get them the competitive edge, that next generation of competitive edge, whether it's mobility, whether it's better interaction, better services, better delivery, more real-time, whatever. Just embrace it. Don't be scared of it. It is hard. You're absolutely right. Security is hard, and that's not going away. It's getting worse. But that's not to say that you shouldn't innovate, you shouldn't try, you shouldn't sort of push the boundaries, because otherwise, well, what are we all doing here?
I think the important thing is about securing your data. I think if we're putting it back always to security, it's like the first thing which we need to do is have complete visibility. So understand where is your data, what are the applications which you're using, wherever it may be it it's cloud or be it it's your enterprise or be it it's your endpoints. Once you know the applications, who are the users, what are they doing, how are they connecting, and then what is the data which we're transmitting. Then we need to reduce your attack surface. So make sure that we're protecting what we really need to protect, and we're blocking what we don't want to be utilised, bad applications, URLs, whichever it may be. Then where we need to then go is then to prevent the unknown and then prevent the known. Prevent the known and then prevent the unknown, which is the more difficult one. And once we have that idea and understand where the data resides and where we're going, it's then about consistent security across all of those form factors and making sure that there's automation and orchestration. And if the channel partners have that understanding and go with that methodology, then they're going to be able to secure the customer's data and make the customer secure in the best way possible.
Yeah, I think for the end user, the end customer rather, leveraging services in the cloud can have huge benefits. Not necessarily cost benefits, but huge benefits in terms of scalability, availability of services that just didn't exist 2 years ago. And if you're not taking advantage of those as an enterprise, you're doing yourself a real disservice. But at the same time, most enterprises don't even understand what those services are that the cloud providers provide. They certainly don't understand how to secure them. So the role of the reseller, the partner here, is to be the expert at, here are the services that, and pick a focus, pick a niche, if you want, but these are the kind of services you can leverage out of Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, whoever, that you can build into your workflow to be more competitive, to be more faster, more agile, et cetera. And here, we'll help you to not only leverage deploy these services and take advantage of them, but do it in a compliant way, do it in a secure way. The end user needs to understand those and make sure that they've satisfied their own compliance requirements and things like that. But because there is so little distributed understanding of what are those services and how do you secure them, there's a massive opportunity for a qualified partner to go in and say, hey, look at all these things that are available for pennies that you can leverage, and we'll help you get there and get there in a secure way.
Brilliant. Okay, I'd just like to thank all of our panel for coming along today and their brilliant insights. I'd like to thank Arrow for making today possible, and just like to thank everyone for joining us today. Until next time.